Well, Britain is rolling out the red carpet for President Trump. And as the UK prepares to leave the European Union, it needs friends more than ever. But is the so-called special relationship really special anymore? Welcome to Roundtable. Now, depending on who you believe, President Trump's state visit to the UK is either cementing the special relationship or testing it to the limit. He's certainly being given the special treatment, but are there signs that this historic alliance is fading?
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
The US and UK have prided themselves over the years on sharing a cultural, political and economic bond. The term special relationship was first coined in 1946 by former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, emphasising the need for the two powers to stand against the Soviet Union and rebuild Europe. Fast forward 73 years, Brexit is changing Britain's alliance with the US, and Trump's values are not being echoed across the Atlantic. 77% of the British public have an unfavourable view of Donald Trump, according to polls. The trip was condemned by Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry, who said the president had systematically assaulted all the shared values that unite our two countries. Are those shared values changing? And with Britain on its way out of the EU, is it still useful to its superpower ally?
Well, joining us to discuss all of that at the round table is Lee Rotherham, a Conservative political consultant. Kathleen Burk, Professor of History at the University College London. To my left here, we have Inderjeet Parmar, Professor of International Politics at City University. And finally, the journalist Stephen Paduano, who is with Foreign Policy. Stephen, you have the added benefit of being an American, living in this country. Let's just start with the basic question. What established the special relationship, and do those factors still come into play, or are they in the past tense now?
The factors that established the special relationship certainly still come into play. It was a term that was really brought into popular use by Winston Churchill at the end of the Second World War, and the alliance, the Anglo-American alliance, still has importance. If you think about it in the context of keeping together sort of a Western-led world, to some degree it's of increasing importance with Russian revanchism and the rise of China, if the factors may have changed a bit.
And what was it based on specifically? What were the pillars of that relationship?
There were multiple. It was a military alliance. Initially, it's also a philosophical alliance, an alliance of particular political values that, to some degree, World War II was about.
Do you think the military aspects have declined as Britain has declined?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
When the alliance was first created, or even before that, during the Second World War, the United Kingdom had this great navy. In the First World War, the greatest navy the world had ever known. Afterwards, that's not so much the case. The United Kingdom can't really conduct its own foreign policy by 1956 with the Suez Crisis. And increasingly throughout the Cold War, you have an issue where the United Kingdom isn't really carrying its slack. By the 1990s, early 2000s, in Kosovo, the United States is conducting 2/3 of all air sorties. In Iraq, the United Kingdom can't hold on to Basra. In Afghanistan, the United Kingdom needs American reinforcements in Helmand Province. So it's come a long way since World War I and World War II. And that long way has been almost entirely downhill.
Inderjeet, the health of that special relationship today?
Well, I think, as Stephen pointed out, the factors of power have changed totally from the 1940s. I mean, to some extent, you could argue that there is a series of relationships which are quite deep and long-standing. So in intelligence and nuclear issues, for example, you may not want to fully call it special, but it certainly is different, probably between any other powers.
And what accounts for that? Is it the language?
There's a level of trust, I think. And I think that underpins, or maybe is underpinned by, the fact that Britain, as a former imperial power, but with a kind of global idea or vision or desire to continue that global role, and having the City of London as a kind of core strength, which is global in its character, I think that mentality has not shifted fundamentally, and that coincides with the United States' own concept of a kind of global management. So, if you like, the two pillars of the post-war order, Britain and the United States, they've changed position. One is far, far more powerful than it was and so on. But I think at the same time, there is a shared idea about global management. And if you like, both of those pillars are trying to loosen their connections with key pillars of the system of which they were the architects during the 1940s.
What do you think about that, Kathleen?
Well, I agree with most of it, not with all of it. I agree with the trust. I agree with the pillars, in particular, the intelligence pillar, which remains even as the nuclear might be declining a little bit for obvious reasons.
And that's because the threat from terrorism is still very high.
Well, there is that. It's also because of lack of money in Britain. You can't have a foreign policy and a military policy unless you can pay for it. And so the British economy is not what it was in terms of supporting it. But the thing is, I mean, the Anglo-American relationship in certain elements rises and falls with the leader. Because to have a strong alliance, you need public support, at least in a democracy. And that, as we can see, goes up and down. But habits are there. If you're in Lagos and something's happening and you're the second secretary at the British Embassy, you're going to ring the second secretary of the American Embassy, because one of Britain's great, great strengths, which people forget about, is diplomacy. The ability to build coalitions for 3 centuries has been one of British strength. And trust, I do really, that's important. No matter what else goes as well, the intelligence will remain, because for an alliance, you need both sides to be able to contribute, and Britain contributes in intelligence.
How strong is the special relationship in your opinion, and which of the pillars that it was built on survive today?
There's been some brilliant points made so far, which pretty much encapsulate the core elements here. I think there are a couple of key points to note, and that's the nature of the special relationship, if we still use the same terminology, has changed massively over very many years. The special relationship, as some people have historically seen it, was at its strongest, I would suggest, between spring 1941 and autumn 1944, at a point where the UK Empire and Commonwealth forces were more than US forces in contact with the enemy throughout the world. After that point, it becomes increasingly and very quickly clear where the preponderance of power lies within the relationship, and Churchill himself, in his war memoirs, increasingly acknowledges this quite openly in terms of the difficulties he's having in terms of persuading his American partners to agree on strategy and direction. So with the reduction of power as comparatively to the United States over time, the nature of the relationship changes. And I quite agree also with what you say in relation to the individual's concern, because a lot of this is, you do of course have relationships, parts of the relationship which are based on trust, particularly where you've got sensitive, highly classified material, whether it's nuclear technology or relationship to intelligence. And trust is something which builds over time. But you also have the personalities and the characters. And that's why I think with the ebb and flow over time, you see the relationship changing and becoming much closer sometimes and much further away at other times. And I would suggest possibly one of the relationship factors is the nature of the party politics on both sides of the pond, because paradoxically, the UK elite, I would suggest, is more inclined to support a Democrat presidency, just inclined, and less inclined to be favourable towards a more Republican presidency. And paradoxically, conversely, a Democrat presidency is more inclined to be globalistically liberal and less focused on a bilateral relationship. So the more London elites look towards the US and go, oh, it's a Republican, and so we're not very friendly, we're not being very
Where's
sort
the
of pro them.
paradox there? I'd expect, the London elites to fawn over a Democrat leader.
Yes, but the point is this, that by supporting one side of the political divide more than the other, they're actually more, I would suggest, more supporting those who are more inclined to be globalist and therefore less inclined to perceive there being a special relationship.
And Stephen, what about, we were mentioning individuals, well, the individuals at the top of government are important too. We've seen Thatcher and Reagan, Jack and Mac, and various other combos. It's a bit difficult now to compare a super lame duck prime minister to the president. But the president has made his opinion known about who he would like to see succeed her, Boris Johnson. Let's just imagine for a moment we had Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. Where would that take the special relationship?
It would take it in, first and foremost, perhaps comical and somewhat theatrical directions. But I think that the first point to note is that the British prime ministers historically haven't really had much of a choice. I think that it's important, Tony Blair aligned himself quite closely with people of different political stripes. He didn't have a choice. I think if you look back at...
First with Clinton and then with Bush.
And then with Bush. You look at...
Both in military action.
Yes.
First of all, Kosovo, and then in Iraq.
And then in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think that today, again, there wouldn't be much of a choice. I think that Boris Johnson and Donald Trump both have many qualities that are quite similar, but I don't necessarily think that breeds a good working relationship.
Well, let's come back to you, Hazel, as a dual citizen of the United States and the United Kingdom. Is it not true that someone like President Trump, who's famous for having somewhat a thin skin, would actually prefer to work with somebody he calls a friend, like Boris Johnson, than, say, Jeremy Corbyn, who's now refused to meet him at the state banquet? So personalities matter. And even on the matter of intelligence, he said he would have to meet Jeremy Corbyn before he felt comfortable sharing American intelligence with him. So personalities matter at the top.
They matter, but personalities come and go.
Right.
And what is there? The intelligence bureaucracy on both sides.
Institutions.
That's right.
Yes, right.
In other words, habits are only broken for a reason. And a president who doesn't take the time to, we understand, to investigate how these things work, can say things. But I should also point out one little thing, is that it matters when they're friends because, in a sense, they might incline one way or another. But very few heads of state or prime ministers are going to give away national interest just because they're dead keen friends and share toothpaste.
So referring to Tony Blair
indeed.
and Bush. So the personalities are less important than we think. It's actually how their interests align and how their institutions over decades work together.
I think that's entirely the case, in fact.
Okay. Let me come to you for a moment, Lee. If let's just imagine for a moment, say, Jeremy Corbyn would become Prime Minister, you think that the special relationship wouldn't be affected?
Oh, blimey, I think the whole thing would fall apart.
And this is, just to declare an interest, you've been an advisor to 3 shadow foreign secretaries, all of which are of a conservative stripe.
Yes.
So you are going to have that.
Well, I accept that. If I didn't think it wouldn't fall apart comically, I wouldn't say so. I mean, comically, but tragically. I mean, look, if you look at the track record, I won't get personal, but if you look at the track record of the individual, he's clearly coming from a very, very left-wing viewpoint, which is a worldview which is diametrically opposed not simply to the US worldview, at least in terms of how the White House sees it, but I would suggest also against US actions over the course of the last 40-odd years.
Let's change it to Brexit for a moment, which is a looming possibility, but not necessarily a done deal. Inderjeet, if I could come to you. Some people are speculating that if the United Kingdom ever does get out of the European Union, it would mean that it turns more to the United States. Others say that it would decline in status because it's not part of a bigger club. What do you think? How would the United States view the UK?
Well, both of those options that you've outlined would be happening at the same time. That Britain's leverage over anybody else would decline with the loss of the membership of the European Union. And secondly, it would be weakened because the United States is such a far greater economy, financial and military power as well. And I think that is why President Trump, champions Brexit so much, a hard Brexit at that, and the leadership of Boris Johnson, and praising Nigel Farage, because if you like, if you get Britain sliced away from the European Union, you then do a trade deal with a much weaker power. The second thing is that's going to require the regulatory framework, which the EU has championed in Britain, to be diminished. And then the EU is probably likely to turn around to the UK and say, your goods and services are not heavily regulated as we require. The consequence of that is going to be you're going to have a loss of trade and business in that regard.
Stephen, you'd agree with these points?
I think that you might be attributing a bit too much strategic calculus to the president here, and I think that the United Kingdom...
No.
The reasons why Donald Trump supports, in the past has supported certain policies, I don't think is as much to do with later on benefits that that the United States might gain in certain circumstances than I think the immediate political sort of tabloid fodder in front of him. But at the same time, I think that there are also core problems here. Just 2 months ago, Nancy Pelosi came to London and she threatened to block a free trade agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom in the event that the Good Friday Accords were infringed in any way. We don't know what's going to happen on October 31st, but if there's a no deal, the Good Friday Accords will be infringed in multiple ways. So
That's right. The special relationship isn't just in the president's hands; it's also in Congress's hands. And but I just want to pick up on what Inderjeet was saying, which I'm sure you disagree with, which is that if, as somebody who worked for Vote Leave, if the UK pulls out of the European Union, it is at the same time diminished and also overly reliant on the US, which then uses that diminished status to just extract more from the UK.
Well, let's take a step back. I mean, the reason why the State Department wanted the UK associated with the EU project from the outset was to support the development of a counterweight against the Soviet Union, and also because it saw the UK as a mechanism for tempering protectionism and certain anti-Atlanticism, a certain degree of anti-Atlanticism within the EU structures. However, and there's a logic to that, however, there was an element of self-interest there, which has been overtaken by events. That we're now no longer in 80% of decision-making within the EU is by qualified majority voting. The UK could no longer act as anything more than a bit of a brake on the development of permanent structured cooperation and a common security defence cooperation. The EU is going along lines which it's just a matter of whether or not the UK can slow it down a bit, rather than stop it within the EU. So it's no longer, I would argue, within the State Department's interest for the UK to be in the EU and basically losing the UK's sort of affiliation. As part of that, I think that's something which John Bolton's quite openly recognised. And we actually now in the UK have a window of opportunity to exploit a friendly president who understands concerns of voters, the voters who voted to leave. And so rather than see that as a threat, I actually see President Trump as a potential benefit for the UK.
Well, I disagree, as we've already realized we do disagree. I mean, the problem is that what Trump makes it clear time and time again that he's concerned about is trade. And Woody Johnson, the American ambassador over here, has made quite clear that opening to the NHS, that chlorine chickens and synthetic fed chemicals cows, to use the cartoon areas, are on the table, and the UK is going to have to accept them. Now,
these are all things that the European Union are strongly opposed to and have very high regulations.
And not to mention a good part of the public opinion in this country. So I don't think trade, okay, let's say Trump isn't worried about Britain having any influence in Europe. I'm happy to accept that. But he does care about trade. And if Britain has no alternative because they're out of the EU, they have to turn to Trump. Who would say that he's not going to take advantage of this power? And even though Trump is only there for at the most 6 more years, once things like that are done, they're done.
You talk about trade. It seems that the special relationship was mostly forged in the sort of white heat of battle or post-battle. And that has been something, the prospect of war and a common enemy has been something that has held them together. When the United States looks for a special relationship these days, it does look very close to a number of countries, including, say, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea. Is the UK-US special relationship still the paramount one, or have those other relationships reached sort of parity or perhaps surpassed it?
May I point out that the term special relationship is claimed by the weaker power. The U.S. only, if it's publicity, claims a special relationship because they have it already. So therefore, I do wish journalists would not make a point of special relationship, because that brings emotion into international relations where it ought not to be.
Sort of mutual feeling, but actually, from the United States perspective, it's not
The United
that special.
States laughs at it. When Clinton came over and Ray Seitz, the then American ambassador, said, "Now don't forget the say the special relationship."
It's sort of like part of the protocol.
Clinton says the special relationship. You know, that's the problem, this special relationship stuff, which ought to have quotation marks around it. Yes, there is one. Yes, there is one, for the reasons that Inderjeet and I in particular, and Stephen have been saying. But it's a military special relationship that normally is supported by the public opinions. I mean, okay for the language, but language means that you can read the criticism as well as the praise.
Inderjeet, the most special relationship the United States enjoys is with?
Well, I guess Israel, but each of those relationships you talked about, South Korea, Japan, Saudi, Israel, they're regional. The only one which has a global idea of itself, for good or bad, and I would argue that it's rooted in its kind of continuing imperial mentalities, is the United Kingdom. The UK is the one which sends the troops into Iraq, into Afghanistan, has got its navy patrolling the South China Sea. It has a global idea of its role. It's much diminished in its significance, but if you like, the United States looks for allies in the UN.
You can always rely on the UK to back you up militarily.
And they'll back you up. They're able and willing to fight in most places where the US says this is a key interest.
Stephen, the other thing, of course, is language, the other common factor. But also, it used to be that the British or the Americans talked about their cousins across the pond. Now, as the United States and indeed the United Kingdom changes ethnically, you sort of ask yourself, what does a Mexican immigrant have in common with, say, a Bengali in East London? As the demographics change, do you think that also will change the special relationship? There'll be no more talk of cousins. It just won't make sense.
I think it's a good question. I think that talk of it literally will change. Winston Churchill had an American mother. Franklin Roosevelt had British cousins.
Boris Johnson had American citizenship.
American citizenship, and Trump's mother is Scottish. However, I think that one interesting thing with the United States and the United Kingdom is that trends do move in parallel a bit. And demographic change is probably going to actually invite different forms of linkages, I would expect. And you can have...
Can you give me an example?
I think that there are perhaps actually more things in common with a Bengali living in, or who is a Bengali British citizen and a Mexican American citizen in the 21st century than one might expect of Reagan and Thatcher. I think that what we are seeing are two movements on the left and the right in both countries that sometimes somewhat mirror each other, and one of them is sort of an equal and opposite response to populism and race baiting that exists in both countries. And I think that people will actually be able to understand common experiences across the pond.
Kathleen, just so we're getting towards the end of the show, but we say that people have more in common, but just to go back to personalities, when Trump comes to this country, there are a lot of protesters, the likes we haven't seen since, perhaps Reagan?
Which goes back to my point that leaders come and go. That they liked Obama, they didn't like George W. Bush, but the continuation of the institutions.
Do you think the population's changing demographic and makeup, ethnic makeup, will make a difference going forward?
Well, what that means is that both countries are now multicultural nations, which is rather different. The U.S. has always been one, although there's been a dominant ethnic Anglo, whites, as it were. Britain is changing as well. And I think Inderjeet's point about they are both global communities is extremely important.
And just a final thought from everyone. We'll start with you, Lee. Do you see it growing or declining?
These things are always one with Nineveh and Tyre, aren't they? The nature of change is that things decline. I think it will depend on the extent to which the United States becomes a more Hispanophone country, to be honest. And I think that will culturally realign the way that US citizens see themselves in the world and where their focus is. So I don't see it changing within a couple of generations, but I think these things do have a tendency of diminishing with the passage of time.
And did you just quickly?
Well, I would argue that the point that you made about the threat, which then brings people together, I think if the United States is successful in constructing China as the greatest threat to the West, then it can dragoon its allies behind that, like it is trying to do with Huawei, for example, in the Made in 2025 China program. I would argue then that strategic relationship is going to get very strong indeed.
That could actually revive it.
It would revive it for the purposes of dealing with an alleged, what I would argue is largely manufactured threat, yes.
A new common enemy, and that will give it new lifeblood. Well, thank you very much, Inderjeet, and thank you also, Stephen, Kathleen and Lee. Thank you all for your contribution to the Roundtable today, and thank you for watching. If you want to see this episode or any other episodes from the Roundtable, please check out our YouTube channel. For now, though, goodbye, and thank you for watching.